The Monarch Grill exuded exclusivity, the kind of place where chandeliers cast golden light over tables adorned with the finest linens, where whispers of high society floated between glasses of vintage wine. Leah had been here before, though not as frequently as her husband's family. Tonight was meant to be another one of those obligatory dinners, the kind where she endured her mother-in-law's passive-aggressive jabs and her husband Jonathan's silence. But she had come prepared, wrapped in a sleek emerald dress that complemented her skin, her heels clicking against the marble floor with quiet confidence. She approached the maitre d', a tall, stiff man with a practiced smile. "Good evening. I'm here for the Carter reservation." His smile faltered slightly as he glanced at the list. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's no reservation under that name." Leah frowned, shifting her clutch to the other hand. "That can't be right. My husband, Jonathan Carter, and his family should be here already." The maitre d' gave her a polite yet firm nod. "I've checked twice. There is no Carter reservation this evening." A cold sense of unease began to creep up Leah's spine. This wasn't a simple mix-up. Before she could speak again, the sound of an unmistakably smug voice reached her ears. "Oh, Leah," Vivian Carter purred, her tone dripping with condescension. "Did you really think you were invited?" Leah turned slowly, meeting the sharp gaze of her mother-in-law. Vivian was the kind of woman who wore wealth like armor, draped in an expensive black dress, a string of pearls resting at her throat, her blonde hair styled in a pristine updo that had likely taken an entire team to perfect. Behind her, Jonathan stood stiffly, his eyes darting away the moment Leah looked at him. His sisters, Rachel and Sophie, flanked him, their expressions carefully neutral. Leah inhaled, steadying herself. "Jonathan told me we were having dinner here tonight," she said evenly. Vivian's smile widened. "Oh, darling, he must have misspoken. This is a family dinner." She let the words hang, the implication sharp enough to cut. Leah's fingers curled against the smooth leather of her clutch. Family dinner. As if she wasn't Jonathan's wife. As if she hadn't spent years trying to integrate into the Carter family, enduring every subtle insult, every calculated exclusion. Rachel let out a small, amused breath, while Sophie at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. But none of them spoke up. Not even Jonathan. He stood there, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored suit, silent. Complicit. Vivian leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You don't belong here, Leah. You never did." The words should have stung. Maybe they would have once. But something inside Leah clicked into place, a quiet, resolute shift. She had spent years trying to fit in, trying to earn their approval, trying to ignore the sinking feeling that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. She lifted her chin, meeting Vivian's gaze without hesitation. "We'll see about that." Vivian's smirk didn't falter. "Oh! And what exactly do you plan to do, darling?" Leah turned back to the maitre d'. "I'd like to speak to the owner." The maitre d' blinked, clearly taken aback. "Pardon?" "The owner," Leah repeated calmly. "Michael Bennett. Tell him Leah Carter is here." Vivian let out a quiet scoff, her expression bordering on amusement. "Really, Leah? Do you think name-dropping will change anything? This is an exclusive establishment." Leah didn't respond. She didn't need to. The maitre d', now visibly flustered, excused himself and hurried toward the back. Jonathan finally shifted, glancing at his mother before looking at Leah. "Leah, there's no need to." But before he could finish, a voice boomed across the restaurant. "Leah Carter?" Michael Bennett strode toward them, his face breaking into a warm, genuine smile. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a presence that commanded attention. Unlike Vivian's carefully curated power, Michael's authority was effortless, the kind that came from years of hard work and respect. Leah smiled, allowing some warmth to seep into her voice. "Michael, it's good to see you." Michael reached out, clasping her hands in his. "What are you doing standing here? You should have told me you were coming." His eyes flicked toward Vivian, his smile cooling by a few degrees. "Is there a problem?" Leah tilted her head slightly. "It seems there was a misunderstanding." My mother-in-law was under the impression that I wasn't welcome here. Michael's brows lifted as he turned his full attention to Vivian. Mrs. Carter, is that so? Vivian's composure wavered, but she quickly recovered. We simply had a private family dinner planned, she said smoothly. I assumed Leah understood that. Michael's lips curved, though his eyes remained sharp. Interesting, considering Leah is like family to me. A beat of silence passed. Vivian's expression froze. Leah watched, amused, as realization dawned on her mother-in-law's face. Michael wasn't just a restaurant owner. He was a mentor, a figure in fine dining that few had the privilege of working under. And Leah? She had trained under him. Michael turned to the maitre d'. Set another place at the Carter table. Vivian inhaled sharply. That's really not. Michael ignored her. Actually, move them to one of the private dining rooms. I'll be sending over a special menu. He glanced at Leah. I assume you'll be staying? Leah smiled, slow and deliberate. Absolutely. Vivian's fingers tightened around the pearl necklace at her throat, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes burning with restrained fury. Rachel and Sophie exchanged quick glances, clearly caught between amusement and awkwardness. And Jonathan still hadn't said a word. As they were led toward their new table, Leah walked with effortless grace, feeling something she hadn't in a long time: power. Not the kind that came from money or status, but the kind that came from knowing who she was. Vivian had wanted to humiliate her tonight. Instead, she had only revealed her own pettiness. And Leah? Leah had just proven, without a single ounce of desperation, that she belonged wherever she chose to be. Leah followed the maitre d' through the softly lit corridors of Monarch Grill, her heels clicking against the polished marble. The restaurant exuded a quiet luxury, subtle yet undeniable, the kind of place where old money whispered and new money tried to prove itself. She could feel the weight of their eyes, Jonathan, his mother, his sisters, burning into her back as they walked. Vivian Carter had expected her to leave, humiliated and small, slinking out of the restaurant with her dignity in tatters. Instead, Leah was being escorted to an even more exclusive dining space, a clear and undeniable power shift that left her mother-in-law seething. Michael Bennett, the owner of Monarch Grill, led the way, his presence as commanding as ever. I should have known I'd find you mixed up in some nonsense, Leah, he said, throwing her a knowing smirk as he opened the doors to a private dining room. She returned the smile. I wasn't expecting a dinner show tonight, but here we are. Michael chuckled, stepping aside to let her pass. The private dining room was a masterpiece of understated elegance, dimly lit sconces, a grand chandelier casting warm golden hues over a polished mahogany table set with the finest china and crystal. It was a room meant for deal-making, for whispered conversations between people who controlled things. And tonight, Leah had secured her seat at that table. Vivian entered behind her, her spine stiff, her movements sharp with barely contained rage. Rachel and Sophie followed, their expressions neutral, but their eyes darting between their mother and Leah with quiet curiosity. And then there was Jonathan, silent, watchful, and infuriatingly passive. The maitre d' pulled out a chair for Leah, and without hesitation, she took her seat. Across from her, Vivian sat down with a sharp, controlled motion, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jonathan hesitated before finally lowering himself into the chair beside his mother, as if waiting for some unseen permission. A server arrived moments later, presenting the wine list with quiet efficiency. Michael took it without hesitation. We'll start with a bottle of the 2012 Chateau Margaux, he instructed. On the house. Leah didn't miss the way Vivian's fingers curled slightly at the edges of the table. The Carters were wealthy, old money, deep and generational, but that didn't mean they were used to being overshadowed in their own circles. And tonight, they were very much being put in their place. Once the server disappeared, Vivian leaned back in her chair, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You certainly have an interesting way of asserting yourself, Leah. Leah met her gaze evenly. I wasn't aware that showing up for a dinner I was invited to required assertion. Vivian's expression remained perfectly composed, but her eyes, sharp, calculating, held no warmth. "Jonathan must have misunderstood," she said smoothly. This was meant to be a private family gathering. A lesser version of herself might have let that sting, might have tried, one last time, to prove she belonged. But Leah had long since outgrown the need for validation from people who had never intended to give it. She folded her hands atop the table. "Then it's fortunate that I'm family." Vivian's smile faltered, ever so slightly. Michael let out a quiet chuckle. "Leah's more than family, Vivian. She's one of the finest professionals I've ever had the privilege of working with. And I don't say that lightly." Sophie, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. "I had no idea you worked in fine dining, Leah." Leah smiled. "I trained under Michael years ago, before I branched out on my own. We've kept in touch ever since." Rachel raised a perfectly arched brow. "You never mentioned that." Leah tilted her head slightly. "I didn't realize it was relevant." The unspoken words hovered in the air. If they had ever cared to ask, they would have known. But they never had. Because to them, Leah had always been the outsider, the woman Jonathan had married, but not someone worth truly knowing. The wine arrived, poured into delicate crystal glasses. Leah took her glass with quiet grace, swirling the deep red liquid before bringing it to her lips. The first sip was exquisite, smooth with just the right amount of weight. Vivian, however, was no longer pretending to enjoy herself. She placed her glass down, then turned her gaze toward Jonathan, her voice deceptively soft. "Jonathan, darling, why don't you tell your wife the real reason we're here tonight?" Leah didn't miss the way Jonathan tensed. A slow, knowing smile curled at the edges of her lips. "By all means, Jonathan," she murmured. "Tell me." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tightening. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal." Leah arched a brow. "What wasn't?" Vivian leaned in slightly, her voice as sweet as poisoned honey. "Jonathan and I have been discussing some changes to the family investments. Naturally, we wanted to make sure everything was aligned before moving forward." There it was. The real reason Leah had been excluded. Not because she wasn't family, but because they had deliberately tried to keep her in the dark about decisions that directly impacted her. She set her wine glass down with deliberate care. "I see. And what exactly does this alignment entail?" Jonathan shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. "It's just a restructuring of some assets." Leah's smile didn't waver, but inside, something cold settled in her chest. She had always known that Jonathan was weak when it came to his mother, that he had a habit of stepping aside rather than standing up. But this was something else entirely. She exhaled slowly, then turned her attention back to Michael. "Michael, you've known me long enough to know I don't waste my time where I'm not wanted." Michael's lips twitched. "That you do." Leah leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering as she looked at Vivian. "Let's stop pretending, shall we? You didn't exclude me tonight because of some misunderstanding. You did it because you didn't want me to be part of the conversation." Vivian didn't deny it. She simply smiled. "I protect my family's interests, Leah. Surely you can understand that." Leah let out a soft breath, shaking her head slightly. "You still don't get it, do you?" Vivian tilted her head. "Get what?" Leah met her gaze, unflinching. "I am the family's interests." Silence. Rachel's lips parted slightly, Sophie inhaled sharply, and Jonathan paled. But it was Vivian whose expression finally cracked, just for a moment, just enough for Leah to see the flicker of realization in her eyes. Leah stood slowly, smoothing out the fabric of her dress. "Michael, thank you for the hospitality. It's always a pleasure." Michael smirked. "Anytime, Leah." Vivian straightened in her chair, regaining her composure. "Leaving so soon?" Leah met her gaze one last time. "I have better things to do than entertain people who don't respect me." Then, without another word, she turned and walked out, leaving the Carter family exactly where they belonged. Behind her, Leah's heels clicked rhythmically against the pavement as she stepped out of Monarch Grill. The night air was crisp, a cool breeze brushing against her skin, but she barely felt it. Her heart pounded, not in nervousness, but in something far sharper, certainty. She had always known where she stood with the Carters. The snide remarks, the exclusion, the quiet moments where she was made to feel like an outsider, it had been years of this. And yet, standing in that private dining room, watching Jonathan sit silent as his mother sought to erase her from the conversation, had shifted something inside her. No, she wasn't just done playing their game. She was done letting them think they had ever been in control of it. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the restaurant. Michael had insisted on arranging transportation for her, a quiet show of support that she appreciated more than she would say aloud. "Leah," a voice called behind her. She knew before turning who it was. "Jonathan." She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before pivoting on her heel. He stood just outside the restaurant doors, looking as unsure as she had ever seen him. His dark navy suit was pristine, his tie slightly loosened as if he had just now realized how suffocating it was. "What?" she asked, her voice level. His jaw clenched. "You didn't have to leave like that." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I wasn't about to sit there and pretend like I was part of a family that didn't even want me at the table." Jonathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You know how my mother is." That single sentence solidified everything for her. "You know how my mother is." As if that excused it. As if Vivian's behavior was something she was simply meant to accept, to tolerate indefinitely. As if his silence, the silence he had chosen, time and time again, was justified because that was just the way things were. She studied him, really studied him. The man she had married. The man she had built a life with. She had thought, at one point, that his passivity was something she could change, that one day, he would finally choose her. But tonight had made one thing clear. He never would. "I do know how she is," she said quietly. "What I don't understand is why you never stood up for me." Jonathan's mouth opened slightly before closing again, as if he wanted to argue, but had nothing to say. "You let her humiliate me tonight," she continued, her voice steady. "And not just tonight. Every time she's left me out, every time she's made it clear I don't belong, you let it happen. You never said a word." His expression tightened. "I didn't want to make things worse." A bitter smile curled at her lips. "Worse for who? Me? Or you?" Silence stretched between them. And that was answer enough. She shook her head. "I'm done, Jonathan." His brows furrowed. "What do you mean, you're done?" "I mean I'm not doing this anymore," she said simply. "Not this marriage. Not this family dynamic where I'm expected to just endure whatever Vivian decides to throw at me while you sit there and watch. I'm done." He let out a breathless laugh, one of disbelief. "Leah, don't be ridiculous." She tilted her head slightly, observing him. He wasn't taking her seriously. He thought this was just another fight, another disagreement they'd eventually brush past. She let that thought settle before speaking. "Jonathan," she said slowly, "who do you think owns Carter Investments?" His expression flickered with something unreadable. "What?" She stepped forward, keeping her gaze locked onto his. "Who do you think funded your first investment deal? Who do you think has been keeping the company's financials afloat?" He shook his head, confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" He stopped, as if realization was finally dawning. "Wait." His voice lowered. "Leah, what are you saying?" She exhaled slowly. "I'm saying that while you've been playing at running a business, I've been the one actually making sure it survives." His face paled slightly. "That's not." "I have controlling shares, Jonathan," she interrupted. "You don't own Carter Investments." "I do." For the first time, real panic flickered across his face. Vivian had spent the evening smugly attempting to remove Leah from the conversation, assuming she was a powerless accessory in Jonathan's world. But the truth? The truth was far more satisfying. She had never needed them. But now? Now, they needed her. "You're lying," Jonathan said, though there was no real confidence in his voice. She smiled. "Am I?" His breath hitched, and for the first time, she saw it, the fear. The realization that he had built his entire life on something he had never truly controlled. She straightened her shoulders. "I'll be filing for divorce," she said, her voice cool, measured. And when I do, you're going to lose everything you thought you had. His face hardened. You wouldn't do that. She let out a quiet, almost amused breath. You don't know me at all, do you? He stepped forward, something desperate in his expression now. Leah, let's talk about this. You don't have to. She took a step back. I do have to. Because she wasn't just walking away from a marriage. She was walking away from a life where she had spent far too long waiting for someone else to choose her. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Fine, he ground out. You want to leave? Then go. But don't think you can take half of my fortune just because you're upset. Leah's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Half? She let the word linger before shaking her head. Oh, Jonathan. She met his gaze, letting the final truth settle between them. It was never yours to begin with. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, the weight of her words sinking in, realizing that the power he had always assumed was his had never been his at all. She turned away, stepping toward the waiting car. The driver opened the door for her, and she slid inside without another word. As the car pulled away, she didn't look back. For years, she had waited. Waited for Jonathan to speak up. Waited for his family to acknowledge her. Waited to feel like she truly belonged. But now? Now, she was done waiting. And for the first time in a long time, she knew exactly where she was going. The soft hum of the city at night filled Leah's ears as the car glided smoothly through the streets. The blurred lights of storefronts and passing traffic streaked against the windows, but her mind wasn't focused on the scenery. She leaned back into the plush leather seat, exhaling a slow, measured breath, feeling the weight of the evening settle onto her shoulders. She had done it. She had finally walked away from Jonathan, from his family, from the suffocating world that had never truly accepted her. And yet, despite the undeniable satisfaction that coursed through her veins, she couldn't ignore the lingering ache just beneath her ribs. It wasn't grief, not in the way one mourns love lost, but rather a quiet realization of just how much she had given to a man who had never deserved it. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down, expecting a message from her lawyer, but instead, Jonathan's name glowed across the screen. She considered ignoring it, letting him stew in the aftermath of his own cowardice. But then, with a resigned sigh, she swiped to answer. Leah, his voice came through, tight, strained. Where are you? She arched a brow. Not that it's any of your business anymore, but I'm on my way home. A pause. Then, can we talk? She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. We did talk, Jonathan. You just didn't like what I had to say. Don't do this, he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. We can fix this. Leah shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. No, Jonathan. You could have fixed this years ago. But instead, you chose silence. She heard his sharp inhale. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, she interrupted, her voice cool. You let your mother treat me like I was nothing. You watched while she tried to erase me, belittle me, exclude me, and you said nothing. Every single time. Jonathan was quiet. She pressed forward. And do you know the worst part? I kept hoping that one day, you'd finally get tired of watching me fight alone. But you never did. Leah, You don't love me, Jonathan, she said, and for the first time, the words didn't hurt. They simply were. You love the idea of me. You love the way I made your life easier. But when it came time to choose, you never chose me. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Is there really nothing I can do to fix this? She closed her eyes briefly, then exhaled. No, Jonathan. There's nothing left to fix. She ended the call. For a moment, she sat in the silence of the car, staring at her own reflection in the window. She didn't feel sadness. She didn't feel guilt. She felt free. When Leah arrived at the house, she didn't waste any time. She moved with precision, slipping out of her heels as she made her way inside, her fingers already working to unfasten the bracelet Jonathan had given her on their anniversary. It slid off easily, clattering against the glass surface of the entryway table. She didn't need any remnants of him. Not in this house. Not in her life. She strode toward the master bedroom, pulling out a sleek black suitcase and opening it atop the bed. Methodically, she began folding clothes, stacking them with practiced efficiency. There was no hesitation, no lingering sentimentality, only action. A part of her wondered how Jonathan would react when he came home to find her gone. Would he finally understand what he had lost? Would he even comprehend that it wasn't just about this dinner, but about years of betrayals, small, silent, insidious? She doubted it. Leah moved to the closet, retrieving the few valuables she cared to take with her. A collection of designer dresses, bought with her money, despite what Jonathan liked to pretend, a pair of heels she had worn to a gala where his mother had conveniently forgotten to introduce her to anyone of importance, and a silk scarf that she had worn the first time she had realized she would never truly belong in their world. It was funny in a way. She had spent so much time trying to carve a space for herself in the Carter family when all along she had been standing in her own shadow, waiting for permission to take up space. She wasn't waiting anymore. Moving to the home safe, she entered the code, one she had insisted on setting herself, much to Vivian's irritation. The door swung open with a quiet click, revealing neatly stacked files, property deeds, and bank statements. All under her name. Jonathan had never been good with numbers. He had liked to think of himself as a businessman, but in truth, he had simply ridden on her coattails, letting her structure the deals, make the investments, and handle the logistics. He had been so sure of his own importance, so certain that his last name was enough to grant him dominance. But Leah had never been just his wife. She had been his foundation. And now, she was pulling herself out from beneath him. She grabbed the documents she needed, slipping them into a sleek leather folder before tucking it into her suitcase. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Jonathan. It was her attorney. Divorce papers ready. We'll file in the morning. Let me know if you want to expedite the asset transfer. Leah's lips curled. Expedite it? She zipped up the suitcase, taking one last look around the bedroom. The space felt hollow now, an empty shell of a life she had outgrown. She turned off the light. She didn't need this house. She didn't need him. By the time Jonathan came home, the house was dark. The only sign of her departure was the open closet, the empty safe, and the letter she had left on the kitchen counter. She had kept it simple. Jonathan. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. The divorce papers are being filed in the morning. Everything else has already been set in motion. You'll find that the accounts you once had access to are no longer yours. The business you thought you controlled now belongs entirely to me. I would say I wish you the best, but the truth is, I don't care anymore. Goodbye, Jonathan. Leah. He would try to fight it. She knew that much. He would call his mother, scramble to find a lawyer, try to find some loophole to salvage the fortune he had taken for granted. But there wouldn't be one. Because Leah had never been careless. She had played by their rules for years. Now? Now, she was making her own. Leah walked into her penthouse, the cool air greeting her as she set her suitcase down in the marble-floored foyer. The space was quiet, but it wasn't an empty quiet, it was the kind that welcomed her, that belonged to her. No judgmental glances from Vivian, no silent, complicit Jonathan. Just her. She inhaled deeply, exhaling as she made her way to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The view stretched endlessly, glittering lights painting a story of movement, ambition, and possibility. This was hers. All of it. She slipped off her heels, her bare feet pressing against the cool hardwood as she moved toward the kitchen. She needed a drink, something strong, something to mark the moment. Reaching for a bottle of whiskey, she poured herself a neat glass, the amber liquid catching the light as she swirled it before taking a sip. The burn was smooth, satisfying. Her phone buzzed against the counter. She glanced at the screen. Jonathan. She smirked, lifting her glass to her lips again before letting the call go to voicemail. She could already picture his panic. The way his world was beginning to tilt, the way his foundation was crumbling beneath him. He had always assumed she was a silent participant in his life, never realizing that she was the one keeping it all together. Tonight, he had learned the truth. And he wasn't the only one. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a different name. Vivian Carter. Leah let out a soft laugh. Of course. She let it ring. She knew exactly what this was, Vivian scrambling, trying to regain control of the narrative. But there was no narrative left for her to control. A moment later, a voicemail alert popped up. Leah raised a brow before pressing play. Vivian's voice came through, clipped and furious. Leah, you think you've won, don't you? You think you can just walk away and take what isn't yours. Let me remind you of something, you are not a Carter. You never were. And you will never be. Leah rolled her eyes, sipping her whiskey as the message continued. Jonathan may be weak, but I am not. I will make sure you regret this. You have no idea who you're up against. A slow smile curved Leah's lips. She deleted the message. Vivian was bluffing. The older woman was powerful in her own circles, yes, but she had built that power through inherited wealth and social manipulation. Vivian had never fought for anything, never had to. Leah, on the other hand, she had built herself from the ground up. She had learned to navigate ruthless business deals, had faced challenges that Vivian could never begin to understand. And most importantly, Leah had already won. She set her glass down, opening her laptop with deliberate movements. A few keystrokes later, she pulled up the financial documents she had retrieved earlier. Jonathan's investments. His entire business empire, now officially under her control. She had spent years being the silent force behind his success, the financial strategist who had turned his name into something valuable. He had never questioned it, never once considered that the very foundation of his power wasn't his own. And now? Now, he was about to find out exactly what it meant to lose. With another few clicks, she sent an email to her attorney. Proceed with the asset transfer immediately. Her phone buzzed again. She sighed, expecting another desperate call from Jonathan. But this time, it wasn't him. It was Rachel. Leah hesitated. Out of all the Carter siblings, Rachel had always been the sharpest, the most observant. She had never been Leah's ally, but she had never been outright cruel, either. Curious, Leah answered. Rachel. A pause. Then, you really did it, didn't you? Leah smirked, leaning against the counter. Seems that way. Rachel let out a slow exhale. Jonathan's losing his mind. My mother is, well, you can imagine. Leah chuckled. Oh, I can. Another pause. Then, softer, I never thought you had it in you. Leah tilted her head. And why's that? Because you put up with us for so long, Rachel admitted. I thought you were just going to keep taking it. Leah hummed, swirling the last of her whiskey. Maybe I thought so too. Until I didn't. Rachel was quiet for a moment before sighing. So, what now? Now, Leah said, setting her glass down, I finish what I started. Rachel let out a dry laugh. I think you already did. Leah smiled but didn't respond. Because no, this wasn't over yet. Not until she made sure that Jonathan and Vivian truly understood what it meant to underestimate her. The next morning, Leah sat in the sleek office of her attorney, reviewing the final documents. The sun filtered through the massive windows, casting a golden glow over the polished wooden desk. Everything is ready, her lawyer said, sliding the papers toward her. Once you sign, the asset transfer will be irreversible. Jonathan will have no legal claim to the majority of the company. Leah picked up the pen, the weight of it cool in her fingers. She met her attorney's gaze. And the divorce? It will be finalized within the month, he assured her. Given the prenuptial agreement, he won't be able to contest much. Leah smiled. Good. She signed with a steady hand, each stroke of ink sealing Jonathan's fate. By the end of the day, the press would know. The business world would know. And the Carters? They would finally understand who they had been dealing with all along. Later that evening, as Leah sipped a glass of champagne on the balcony of her penthouse, she received a text from an unknown number. You won't get away with this. V. Leah smirked, taking another sip. I already did. She blocked the number. The skyline stretched before her, endless and full of possibilities. She had spent years waiting for Jonathan to choose her, waiting for his family to accept her, waiting to feel like she belonged. But the truth was, she had never needed their approval. She had never needed them. She had always been enough. And now? Now, she was finally free. Jonathan arrived home later than usual, stepping into a house that felt strangely different. At first glance, everything appeared the same. The pristine surfaces, the carefully curated decor, the scent of the expensive candles Leah always kept burning. But something was off. It took him a few seconds to realize what it was. The house felt empty. Not physically, furniture was still in place, artwork still hung on the walls, but there was something missing. Something vital. Then he saw it. The closet door in their bedroom was ajar, revealing an unsettling sight. Empty spaces where Leah's clothes had once been. The absence of her scent on her side of the bed, the missing personal items in the bathroom. It hit him like a slow-moving wrecking ball. She was gone. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan truly understood what loss felt like. His pulse quickened as he moved through the house, searching for some indication that this was temporary, that Leah would be back. But the longer he looked, the more it sank in. The jewelry box on her vanity? Gone. The framed wedding photo that used to sit on her nightstand? Removed. Even the small, everyday things, the hairbrush she always left by the sink, the bottle of perfume she spritzed on before meetings, had vanished. Then he saw the letter. Sitting on the kitchen counter, waiting for him like a carefully laid trap. He unfolded the note with stiff fingers, his eyes scanning the words, and with each line, his stomach twisted further. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. He gritted his teeth, reading faster. The divorce papers are being filed in the morning. Everything else has already been set in motion. You'll find that the accounts you once had access to are no longer yours. The business you thought you controlled now belongs entirely to me. He inhaled sharply. No, that's not possible. Jonathan snatched his phone from his pocket, dialing his lawyer with shaking hands. Pick up, he muttered. Come on. The call went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, he tried again, pacing back and forth as his mind raced. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder that he had let this spiral out of control. By the third failed call, he slammed the phone onto the counter. His breathing was unsteady, his thoughts fragmented. He needed answers. Leah couldn't have taken everything. Could she? He stormed into his office, yanking open the desk drawer where he kept key financial documents. He flipped through folders frantically, searching for confirmation that Leah was bluffing. But the deeper he looked, the more dread pooled in his stomach. The accounts, the investments, the company shares, all under her name. She owned Carter Investments. She owned his entire empire. His breath hitched as realization settled like a lead weight in his chest. She had played him. For years, he had assumed she was simply his wife, the woman who stood by his side, who smoothed over his failures, who quietly handled things while he made the public appearances. But she hadn't just been supporting him. She had been running him. And now? She was dismantling him piece by piece. Jonathan let out a ragged breath, gripping the edge of the desk. His mother had warned him about Leah, had insisted she wasn't one of them. And he, in his arrogance, had thought she was simply being dramatic. But now, standing in an office filled with paperwork that no longer held his name, Jonathan realized the truth. Vivian had underestimated Leah. And so had he. An hour later, Jonathan sat in his car outside his mother's estate, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The gates stood tall before him, an imposing symbol of the power the Carter name once held. He stepped out, barely registering the crisp night air as he walked up the grand stone steps. The butler opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice as emotionless as ever. "Your mother is expecting you." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He strode inside, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. He found Vivian in the study, seated in her usual armchair, a glass of red wine in hand. She didn't look up immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip before speaking. "You're late," she murmured, setting the glass down. I assume you finally read Leah's letter. Jonathan clenched his fists. Did you know? Vivian sighed, finally meeting his gaze. Did I know that your wife was playing you for a fool? Of course, Jonathan. His stomach twisted. Why didn't you say anything? Vivian arched a perfectly sculpted brow. Would you have listened? Jonathan swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer for that. Vivian let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. You let her in. You gave her control. And now, she's taken everything. The words hit him like a gut punch. What do I do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vivian leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. You fight. He frowned. How? She tilted her head slightly. You get a better lawyer. You contest everything. You make this difficult for her. Leah may have the upper hand now, but she's not invincible. And she certainly doesn't have the same level of influence that we do. Jonathan hesitated. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Unless, of course, you're planning to do nothing, which, given your track record, wouldn't surprise me. Jonathan flinched. For years, he had accepted his mother's sharp criticisms as part of their dynamic. But tonight, they landed differently. Tonight, he saw the truth. He had spent his entire life being controlled by his mother, by his family's expectations. And when Leah came along, he had let her take the reins, too, because it had been easier that way. He had never truly built anything. He had only inherited, borrowed, relied on others. And now, without Leah, without the financial safety net she had quietly crafted around him, he was realizing something terrifying. Without her, he had nothing. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. What if I can't win this? Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. Then you've already lost. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He could feel his world cracking beneath him, could see the walls closing in. But then, another thought crept in, one he hadn't fully allowed himself to acknowledge until now. If Leah had played him this thoroughly, if she had orchestrated everything so seamlessly, did he ever really deserve to win? He swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Carter didn't know who he was without someone else holding him up. And for the first time, he was truly afraid. Leah's penthouse was bathed in the warm glow of the city lights, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sat on the plush sofa, a glass of wine resting on the table beside her, the weight of the evening settling over her like a perfectly tailored coat. She had done it. She had left Jonathan. She had taken back her power. And yet, as she stared at the phone lying face up on the table, buzzing for the 5th time in the last hour, she couldn't help but feel the sharp edges of finality pressing in around her. Jonathan. Vivian. The Carters had underestimated her for years, dismissed her as nothing more than an accessory to their dynasty. But now, in the aftermath of her departure, they were beginning to understand. She wasn't an accessory. She was the architect of their ruin. With a quiet sigh, she picked up her phone, scrolling through the flood of missed calls and unread messages. Jonathan had called twice more, followed by a string of increasingly desperate texts. We need to talk. Leah, don't do this. I'll fix it. Just tell me what you want. She scoffed. What she wanted was for him to have been a man instead of a bystander in his own marriage. But now? Now, she wanted nothing from him. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Jonathan. Vivian Carter. Leah smirked, sipping her wine as she let the call ring out. If Vivian wanted to talk, she could stew in her own impatience for a little longer. Moments later, a voicemail notification popped up. With mild curiosity, Leah pressed play, her brows lifting as Vivian's icy voice filled the quiet space. You think you've won, don't you? Leah's smirk deepened. You've embarrassed my son, humiliated this family, and for what? Money? Power? If you think this is over, you're mistaken. There was a pause, a deep inhale, and then Vivian's voice dropped to something even colder. You have no idea who you're up against, Leah. You were never one of us. And you never will be. The message ended. Leah chuckled, swirling the last of her wine in her glass. How predictable. Vivian Carter, trying to reclaim the power she had never actually wielded over her. She set the glass down and leaned back against the couch, tilting her head toward the city skyline. Vivian still didn't get it. She had spent years controlling people through wealth, social status, and intimidation. But Leah had never needed any of that. She had built herself from nothing. Vivian had only ever inherited. And that was the fundamental difference between them. With a quiet, deliberate motion, Leah deleted the voicemail. Then, for good measure, she blocked Vivian's number. Let her rage in silence. By the time morning arrived, the news had already spread. The headlines were everywhere. Billionaire's wife takes control. Leah Carter's strategic exit shakes Carter Investments. Divorce or power play? Leah Carter's financial takeover leaves Jonathan Carter scrambling. She was never just the wife, how Leah Carter silently built an empire. Leah smirked as she skimmed through the articles. The media had turned this into a spectacle, dissecting every detail of the power shift. But the best part? She hadn't had to say a single word. Vivian had spent decades curating the image of the Carter family, polished, powerful, untouchable. And yet, with a single move, Leah had dismantled the illusion. The world wasn't talking about Jonathan. They were talking about her. And as for Jonathan, he was learning in real time just how little control he had ever truly possessed. Her phone buzzed again this time, a message from her lawyer. It's done. Jonathan no longer has legal access to Carter Investments. All major accounts have been transferred. Expect backlash, but they don't have a leg to stand on. Leah smiled. She had expected this fight to last longer. But the truth was, she had been preparing for this for years. Jonathan and his mother just hadn't realized it. She replied simply, "Perfect. Let them react." Because now it was their turn to scramble. At that exact moment, inside the Carter estate, Vivian paced the length of her study, the walls closing in around her. The headlines had hit her harder than she had anticipated. She had expected Leah to leave, had even expected some level of retaliation, but this was a public humiliation. And Jonathan? He sat across from her, silent, staring at the documents that had been delivered to him that morning. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Say something," Vivian snapped, her voice razor-sharp. Jonathan didn't look up. "What do you want me to say?" She slammed a hand down on the desk. "You let this happen." His head snapped up then, his expression dark. "I let this happen?" He let out a humorless laugh. "Funny, considering you were the one always telling me to keep her in check." Vivian's eyes flashed. "She was never one of us. And yet, she just took everything from us," Jonathan shot back. Silence. For the first time, Vivian looked uncertain. Jonathan exhaled, running a hand down his face. "She played us, mother. And the worst part? We never saw it coming." Vivian clenched her fists. "Then fix it." Jonathan scoffed. "And how do you suggest I do that? Sue her? Fight for control of a company I don't even own?" Vivian's silence was answer enough. Jonathan leaned back, shaking his head. "She was the smart one all along. I was just too blind to see it." Vivian inhaled sharply. "You're not giving up." Jonathan didn't respond right away. He simply stared at the legal documents, at the undeniable proof of Leah's triumph. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "I don't have a choice." Vivian's lips curled in disgust. "Pathetic." Jonathan let out a dry laugh. "No. What's pathetic is thinking I ever had control in the first place." Back in her penthouse, Leah stood by the window, sipping another glass of wine as the sun set over the city. She had thought she might feel something, regret, vindication, maybe even a trace of sadness. But all she felt was relief. For so many years, she had been waiting. Waiting for Jonathan to see her. Waiting for his family to accept her. Waiting to feel like she truly belonged. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She belonged here. In a life she had built for herself. And as she gazed out at the city, her city, she knew one thing for certain. She was free. And nothing had ever felt better. The golden glow of dusk stretched over the city skyline, casting long shadows across Leah's penthouse. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of champagne in hand, watching the streets below buzz with movement. The world hadn't stopped spinning just because she had upended the Carter dynasty, but in many ways, it felt like her world had just begun. It had been exactly 1 month since she had left Jonathan. 1 month since she had stepped out of Monarch Grill and into her power. 1 month since she had set in motion a series of events that would ensure she would never again be underestimated, belittled, or ignored. Now, the divorce was finalized. The last of the financial transfers had been completed. Jonathan's business empire, once something he had paraded around as his, was officially, legally, hers. And, as expected, he had tried to fight. The first few weeks had been filled with calls from his lawyers, weak threats of lawsuits, and desperate attempts to negotiate. He had begged, pleaded, even raged. But it had all been too late. Leah had been meticulous, leaving him with no legal foothold to reclaim anything he had assumed was his. Vivian had fought just as hard, had tried to leverage her connections, whisper in the right ears, and control the narrative. But even she had come to realize there was no winning this battle. Leah had already won. She sipped her champagne, her lips curling in satisfaction. The penthouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel lonely, but intentional. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she wanted to be. A soft chime pulled her from her thoughts. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. She hesitated for a brief second before answering. Leah Carter speaking. A pause. Then, a familiar voice filled the line. Still using my last name? She let out a soft chuckle. Not for long. Jonathan sighed on the other end. You really did it. She swirled the champagne in her glass, watching the bubbles rise. I did. There was a long silence. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, more tired. Do you ever wonder if we could have done things differently? Leah tilted her head slightly. No, because I did everything I could to make it work, Jonathan. You were the one who stood by and watched. He exhaled sharply. I didn't realize. That's exactly the problem, she interrupted, her voice firm but calm. You never realized. Not when I fought for your respect. Not when I tried to belong in your family. And certainly not when I was the only reason your business didn't collapse years ago. Jonathan didn't reply. She took another sip of champagne. If you're calling to convince me to change my mind, don't waste your breath. Another beat of silence. Then, a quiet chuckle. You know what the worst part is? Leah raised an eyebrow. Do tell. I never thought I needed you. She smiled. And now, his voice was softer this time. Now I know I did. Leah let the moment hang between them, the final piece of closure she hadn't even realized she wanted. You'll survive, Jonathan, she said, setting her glass down. You always do. But next time, maybe choose a woman you're actually willing to fight for. Before he could respond, she ended the call. She stared at the phone for a moment, then, with a slow breath, blocked his number. It was done. Later that evening, Leah found herself sitting on the rooftop terrace of the penthouse, a cool breeze brushing against her skin. She had planned to spend the night alone, indulging in the quiet victory of her newfound freedom. But when her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Rachel Carter, curiosity got the better of her. Dinner? Leah considered ignoring it. After all, she had spent years being nothing more than an outsider to the Carter family. But Rachel had always been different. She hadn't been an ally, not exactly, but she had been aware. With a small smirk, Leah typed back. Only if you're buying. An hour later, Leah slid into a sleek booth at a dimly lit lounge, crossing her legs as Rachel set a glass of wine in front of her. You look good, Rachel remarked, sipping her own drink. Leah smirked. Freedom suits me. Rachel let out a soft laugh, tilting her head as she studied her. You know, I always thought you were too nice. Leah raised a brow. Is that a compliment or an insult? Neither, Rachel said with a shrug. Just an observation. You played the role perfectly. The patient wife. The accommodating daughter-in-law. The woman who could smile through anything. Leah took a slow sip of wine. And Rachel's lips curled. And then you burned it all to the ground. Leah chuckled, setting her glass down. You sound impressed. Rachel shrugged. A little. You did something no one's ever done before. You outplayed my mother. Leah hummed, tapping a finger against the stem of her glass. She thought I was weak. Rachel smirked. She still does. But that's what makes this so perfect, don't you think? Leah studied her for a moment. And what about you, Rachel? Why the sudden interest in grabbing dinner? Rachel leaned back, swirling the wine in her glass. Let's just say, watching my mother lose a battle for the first time has been enlightening. Leah arched a brow. Are you looking for tips? Rachel grinned. Maybe. Leah laughed, shaking her head. Well, here's the first one. Never let people think they own you. Not your family, not your last name, not the world you were born into. The moment they do, they stop respecting you. Rachel considered that for a moment before nodding. Noted. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past month finally settling into something real. Leah had spent years being careful, being quiet, trying to fit into a life that was never meant for her. But she wasn't quiet anymore. And she wasn't looking for a place to belong. She belonged to herself. And as she lifted her glass to her lips, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.